Hello, I'm Sean Curran, and this is Politics UK. Welcome to your weekly roundup of parliamentary highlights. I'll be joined by correspondents in Edinburgh, Cardiff and Belfast, and here in Westminster by our parliamentary correspondent, Alicia McCarthy. On the programme this week, the row over alleged racist comments made by a Conservative donor dominates Prime Minister's questions.
How low would he have to sink? What racist, woman-hating threat of violence would he have to make before the Prime Minister plucked up the courage to hand back the £10 million that he's taken from him?
As I said, the gentleman apologised genuinely for his comments, and that remorse should be accepted.
Labour attacks government plans to release some prisoners up to 2 months early to ease overcrowding in jails.
Rushing out measures like this will increase the risk to the public, and I hope the Secretary of State, when he responds, will have the honesty to admit it.
What she didn't address was the fact that when she was in government, for 3 years, the Labour Party ran a similar scheme.
And in Wales, disagreement over plans to ensure equal representation of women in the Senedd.
Evidence shows that one of the main barriers to the election of women is the fact that some political parties have not put forward women candidates in sufficient numbers.
We believe that people should be elected to this Senedd and should be candidates for election to this Senedd on the basis of merit.
But let's start here in Westminster with Alicia McCarthy. Now, Alicia, it's been another difficult week for Rishi Sunak. It started with the defection of Lee Anderson, a former deputy chairman of the Tory party, who's now sitting as a Reform MP. And then we had that major row over alleged racism by a big Conservative donor that ended up dominating Prime Minister's questions.
Yes, you're absolutely right. So this is all about comments that both the Prime Minister and Number 10 have described as racist and wrong that have been made by a Conservative Party donor, Frank Hester, about the veteran MP Diane Abbott. Now, Diane Abbott, a very familiar figure around Westminster. She was a Labour MP for many, many years, but she has in the last year or so been sitting as an independent because basically she had the whip removed for her own comments that she made about racism. Now, going back to Mr Hester, according to the Guardian newspaper back in 2019, he said, looking at Diane Abbott makes you want to hate all black women, and he said the MP should be shot. Now, he has apologised for those comments, which he said were rude, but said they were nothing to do with her colour or her gender. Now, Mr Hester, the reason that this is a problem, particularly for Rishi Sunak, is that Mr Hester has donated £10 million to the Conservative Party and apparently £15,000 specifically for Rishi Sunak to take a helicopter flight. So all through the week there have been calls for the Conservatives to give that money back, and those really came to a head on Wednesday, and they were the obvious line of attack for Sir Keir Starmer at Prime Minister's questions.
Is the Prime Minister proud to be bankrolled by someone using racist and misogynist language when he says the member for Hackney North and Stoke Newington makes you want to hate all black women?
Mr Speaker, the alleged comments were wrong, they were racist, and he has now, as I said, the comments were wrong, they were racist. He has rightly apologised for them, and that remorse should be accepted, Mr Speaker. There is no place for racism in Britain, and the government that I lead is living proof of that.
Mr Speaker, the man bankrolling the Prime Minister also said that the member for Hackney North should be shot. How low would he have to sink? What racist, woman-hating threat of violence would he have to make before the Prime Minister plucked up the courage to hand back the £10 million that he's taken from him?
Mr Speaker, as I said, the gentleman apologised genuinely for his comments, and that remorse should be accepted. But he talks about language. He might want to reflect on the double standards of his deputy leader, calling her opponents scum, Mr. Speaker. His shadow foreign secretary, the shadow foreign secretary, comparing Conservatives to Nazis, Mr. Speaker, and the man that he wanted to make Chancellor, talking about lynching a female minister. His silence on that speaks volumes.
Mr. Speaker, the difference is he's scared of his party. I've changed my party. Mr. Speaker.
I want to hear both the Prime Minister and lead the opposition. Keir Starmer.
2 weeks ago, the Prime Minister invited himself into everyone's living room at 6 o'clock on a Friday evening. No one asked him to give that speech. He chose to do it. He chose to anoint himself as the great healer and pose as some kind of unifier. But when the man bankrolling his election says the member for Hackney North should be shot, he suddenly finds himself tongue-tied, shrinking in sophistry, hoping he can deflect for long enough that we'll all go away. What does the Prime Minister think it was about the hundreds of millions of pounds of NHS contracts given to Frank Hester by his government that first attracted him to giving £10 million to the Tory party in the first place?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I'm absolutely not going to take any lectures from somebody who chose to represent an anti-Semitic terrorist group, Hizb ut-Tahrir, who chose to serve a leader who let anti-Semitism run rife in this Labour Party. Those are his actions, those are his values, and that's how he should be judged.
The gentleman in question apologised for being rude. He wasn't rude, he was racist, he was odious, and he was downright bloody dangerous. Now, on Monday, the number 10 said, we've seen an unacceptable rise in extremist activity which is seeking to divide our society and hijack our democratic institutions. Isn't it extremism that we should all be worried about? The views of those Tory donors that we've read about this week?
Prime Minister.
No, Mr. Speaker, there has actually been a rise in extremist activity that is seeking to hijack our democratic institutions. It's important. It is important that we have the tools to tackle this threat. That's what the extremism strategy will do, and I would urge him to wait for the Community Secretary to release the details.
Now, Alicia, we saw Diane Abbott in the pictures of those exchanges there, but we didn't hear her during Prime Minister's questions.
No, we didn't. And that's because the way it works is that if you want to ask a question at Prime Minister's questions, you put your name forward and then there's a ballot and the names are picked out at random and that produces a list. And the Speaker during Prime Minister's questions works his way through that list. Now, he can and does call MPs additionally to those names, but because there were lots of Labour MPs on the list, Diane Abbott didn't get in and time ran out.
Now, we also heard Rishi Sunak talking about an anti-extremism strategy there. And a little later in the week, the Community Secretary, Michael Gove, gave us more information. What did he say?
Yeah, that's right. This all stems back. You remember a couple of weeks ago, we had that slightly extraordinary scene of Rishi Sunak on the steps of Downing Street talking about extremism and the threat that it poses to the UK. And obviously that relates to the current conflict in the Middle East and the scenes that we've seen there on our television and the terrible things that have happened on both sides of that conflict. Now, that has resulted in a large number of demonstrations and a big rise in extremism on both sides, attacks on both communities. So Michael Gove came to the Commons and set out a new definition of extremism. And basically what it's going to do is to identify groups and they'll be barred from getting any grants or access to government. The idea is that it will stop these groups with these extremist ideologies from inadvertently getting any kind of legitimacy or funding or anything like that. And the idea is to clamp down on them. Now, the government says there'll be a very high bar for this definition of extremism, but there have still been some concerns about freedom of speech, for example. So Michael Gove came along to the Commons and explained what the government was trying to do.
Extremism is the promotion or advancement of an ideology based on violence, hatred or intolerance that aims to negate or destroy the fundamental rights and freedoms of others, or undermine, overturn or replace the UK's system of liberal parliamentary democracy and democratic rights, or intentionally create a permissive environment for others to achieve these results. It is important to stress that we are in no way intending to restrict freedom of expression, religion or belief. But the government cannot be in a position where, unwittingly or not, we sponsor, subsidise or support in any way organisations and individuals opposed to the freedoms we hold dear.
Hateful extremism threatens the safety of our communities and the unity of our country. Everyone across this House can agree that this is a serious problem which demands a serious response. So I want to begin by saying from the outset, when it comes to our national security, when it comes to the threat of radicalisation, when it comes to the toxic scourge of Islamophobia, neo-Nazism, anti-Semitism or any other corrosive hatred, the whole House can and should work together.
Angela Rayner there, but of course that debate will continue. Thank you, Alicia. Stay with us, though, because we hear more from you in a little while. Let's go to Edinburgh now, and our Scotland political correspondent, David Wallace-Lockhart, who's at the Scottish Parliament in Holyrood. So, David, the political week at Holyrood kicked off with a bit of a scandal about some erotic art. What was that all about?
It did, Sean. Quite an incredible story here that involves an art project described as a magical erotic journey through a distinctly Scottish landscape that ends in a secret cave sex party. Now, the context here is there's the public body Creative Scotland. It awards grants to arts projects in Scotland, and it gave a grant of £85,000 to a project called Rain. It was actually the second grant that particular project had got. It was due to premiere in the autumn of next year, but when you went to the art project's website and read about it, it did seem that the project involved quite literally people having sex with one another and being paid £270 a day for their efforts. It had been advertising for performers over the age of 18 with previous sex work experience. Now, given that Creative Scotland is a public body, given that it was giving lottery funding to this art project, it's not surprising that this became quite a big political issue, and it did get discussed in Holyrood this week.
It has been reported that the filming was to involve live sex acts and to be done in outdoor public places in the Highlands. There are clearly questions to be answered, not just about the appropriateness of what was planned with public funds, but also the legality. Does the Minister agree that this should be examined, and more generally there should be a review of funding criteria and new guidance issued for future applications so this cannot be allowed to happen again?
I share the concerns that have been raised, including by Creative Scotland itself. I can see no way where what has been described should be in receipt of public funding. As members are aware, the Scottish Government has no role in the decisions of Creative Scotland for the funding of individual projects. However, Creative Scotland are, I understand, rapidly reviewing this allocation, as they have been clear that what has been reported simply does not meet what the funding was applied for.
And we did hear Angus Robertson, the Culture Secretary there, stressing that government ministers here in Scotland don't get involved with the operational day-to-day grant giving of Creative Scotland, but making it quite clear that he didn't think the money should be going towards this project. And we have since had an update from Creative Scotland, who are removing the grant from the Rain project, and they're also saying that the application they got did not reflect the fully explicit nature of the arts project.
Now, David, MSPs are spending some time at the moment scrutinising a bill concerning intimidation around abortion clinics, aren't they? It's prompted a debate about free speech.
Yeah, so this is a members' bill at Holyrood that's trying to create so-called buffer zones around abortion clinics. And the idea here is you could create a 200-metre exclusion zone for anyone trying to influence someone who was going to get an abortion or going to work at an abortion clinic. And that's even if this was in a public space. Now, there has been an increase in such gatherings in Scotland in recent years, quite often vigils with religious imagery, people holding placards, trying to encourage people not to get abortions. And MSPs in committee have been taking evidence on this bill. They've been hearing both from those who support the idea of legislation in this area and those who are opposed to legislation. And this week, it was those who don't think this bill is a good idea who are appearing in front of a Holyrood committee. And MSPs heard from a woman called Alina who had her own story to tell.
I wanted to keep her, but I didn't know how, so my hope rapidly began to fade. The day that I turned up to my abortion appointment, a volunteer outside the clinic gently gave me a leaflet. Somewhere beneath the palpable anxiety and pressure, I felt it provide me with exactly what I was longing for.
Well, it wouldn't have been appropriate for you to be praying in the room where the procedure was taking place while it was taking place, and that, therefore this isn't a black or white about restriction or no restriction. It's about where we place that restriction.
We've always been very respectful of private property, but we're talking about a public street now, and I think that creates a very different situation when we're talking about somebody can't pray on a public street. So clearly, if it's a public street and we're simply banning thoughts if they're directed towards God, that's really concerning. Even if somebody else doesn't understand why we're doing that or the importance of that, and I appreciate that other people might not understand or believe in all the things that I believe in, but to criminalise my thoughts because they're directed towards God, I think that's actually discrimination.
Even some women just say, I was just looking for a sign. I was looking for a sign that I didn't have to do this. And there are people standing out there with signs. And so that's quite literally being present to women at their point of need. Now, I recognise that that's not how all women feel about pro-life vigils, but I just encourage the committee to have a bit of, to see that the perspectives of women vary.
Now, this is a member's bill from the Scottish Green MSP, Gillian Mackay, and she said there's no excuse for the harassment that far too many people have had to endure when accessing healthcare. These protests should not be happening. This bill does have cross-party support. It is likely to pass through the Scottish Parliament without too many problems, but there have been anti-abortion campaigners based in the USA who've indicated that they are likely to mount a legal challenge if this does become law.
David, the focus of First Minister's questions this week, not for the first time and probably not for the last, was the drug death situation in Scotland.
That's right. So we got estimated figures from police in Scotland on suspected drug deaths in 2023, a 10% increase, up by over 100 since 2022. And obviously this has been a very long-running issue in Scottish politics. Drug deaths here, the worst, not just in the UK, but the worst drugs death rate in Europe. And the latest figures did form the backdrop to First Minister's questions this week, with both Douglas Ross from the Scottish Conservatives and Anas Sarwar from Scottish Labour choosing to quiz Humza Yousaf on this issue.
The addiction crisis in Scotland is out of control. Since the SNP came to power, drug deaths have doubled. They are the worst in Europe, and new figures show deaths are increasing again. Scotland's shame has not gone away.
We have the exact same drug laws as everywhere else in the UK, but almost 3 times as many drugs deaths here in Scotland. The outcome we need this government to deliver is fewer people dying from drugs, not more and more people dying every year. Because it's been 4.5 years since the SNP government declared a drugs death emergency. 3 years since the launch of their national mission to reduce drug deaths, and almost 2 years since the final report of the Drugs Death Task Force. But yet, in the last year, 1,197 more people have died. Incompetence has consequences.
There are many parts of the world, and of course right across the UK in particular, where there are challenges with synthetic opioids, nitazines, fentanyl, and so on and so forth, which are more addictive, more potent, and therefore causing real harm and real concern right across the United Kingdom. That's why Anas Sarwar and Douglas Ross were both right to say that levels of drug deaths in Scotland are unacceptable and per head of the population higher than other parts of the UK. But we have, of course, seen increases in England and Wales, and I suspect it's largely down to the same issues that we're facing collectively, that we're seeing more addictive substances on our streets, such as synthetic opioids. And I can give an absolute guarantee, a promise to not just those in the chamber, but those that are listening, that where we can try innovative approaches, new approaches, then we will absolutely seek to do that. That's why we're supporting Glasgow with funding for the safer consumption room. It's why we're supportive of checking facilities for drugs and other interventions as well. And if we did have the power over the Misuse of Drugs Act, for example, we would seek to make changes in relation to the decriminalisation of drugs for personal use.
So Hamza Yusuf saying this is in part at least about more powerful synthetic opioids being available that are particularly addictive. And the Scottish Government is trying to introduce new policies in this area. Work is underway to set up a drugs consumption room in Glasgow where drug users would be able to go and take drugs under supervision, and the Scottish Government hoping that policies like that will have an effect. Now, Hamza Yusuf was talking about being more innovative in areas like this. He did go on to say that if drug laws were actually devolved to Holyrood, he would at least consider decriminalising drug possession, at least for personal use, but there's no sign of those laws being devolved from Westminster anytime soon. So this continues to be a massive issue in Scottish politics, and we do expect more annual figures that will come in the summer. And if those figures go up, you would expect, once again, Scottish Government to face a lot of questions about the issues of drug deaths in Scotland.
David Wallace-Lockhart at Holyrood, thank you very much. Now, let's go back to Westminster and our parliamentary correspondent, Alicia McCarthy. Now, Alicia, the Justice Secretary, Alex Chalk, came to the Commons to address concerns about overcrowding in prisons in England and Wales. And it's probably fair to say that Labour wasn't very happy.
No, you're absolutely right. So basically, in the past, the government has said we are going to let some people out of prison up to 18 days early in England and Wales to try to ease overcrowding. Prison capacity in England and Wales is about 89,000, and it's thought there are about 88,200 people in prison. So there's not a lot of space left. So the government announced that it's going to expand this scheme and people will be let out up to 60 days early. Now, the government says there will be safeguards in place and that governors, for example, in prisons will have a veto. But Labour reckons there will still be a risk to the public. And the other thing they were really unhappy about, as you mentioned there, is the way that this was done. They said it was slipped out in what's called a written ministerial statement, i.e. a bit of paper late on a Monday night instead of in the proper way. So when Alex Chalk did come to the Commons on Tuesday, he talked about what the government was going to do, but he focused most of his comments on another part of this plan, which is trying to send more foreign national offenders back to their country of origin. And he said that they were about 12% of prisoners in England and Wales jails, and that was putting a real strain on both places and on the public purse.
Today, Mr. Speaker, I can announce that we're going even further to make sure we have the prison places we need to continue locking up serious and violent offenders for longer, and I want to focus in particular on foreign national offenders, who I'll call FNOs from now on. We're amending our deportation policy so we can remove those on suspended sentences of 6 months or more. We are making more use of the diplomatic levers we have to remove people back to their home countries. This will allow us to deport more FNOs directly from prison in 2024, more than double the 1,800 we removed last year. Mr. Speaker, we will also extend the existing end of custody supervised licence measure to around 35 to 60 days. We will enable this to happen for a time-limited period and work with the police, prisons and probation leaders to make further adjustments as required. This will only be for certain low-level offenders. Where necessary, electronic monitoring will be applied to enhance public protection. Ministers will, of course, continue to keep use of this measure under review. This extension has been requested and supported by leaders in the prison service and police.
Late in the hours of yesterday evening, this government, Mr. Speaker, tried to quietly slip out an announcement that they are going to be releasing prisoners up to 2 months early in order to deal with a lack of space in our prisons. Let us be in no doubt. This is the most drastic form of early release for prisoners that this country has ever seen. And in his 11-page and 10-minute long statement today, Mr. Speaker, it merited 1 paragraph. This is a measure that will cause shockwaves and deep concern across our country, and the Secretary of State seems to think a quiet written ministerial statement published late last night and 1 paragraph today is good enough. It is not. What is glaringly absent is any additional resource to support the thousands of cases that will now have their release dates brought forward. It is wholly inevitable, Mr. Speaker, that rushing out measures like this will increase the risk to the public, and I hope the Secretary of State, when he responds, will have the honesty to admit it.
She addressed a number of issues. What she didn't address was the fact that when she was in government, for 3 years, the Labour Party ran a similar scheme. And does she want want to explain, when she perhaps comes back, how many were released during that scheme? Well, in which case, I'm sure she'll welcome the opportunity to update the House. Where the Governor has concerns about an individual, that will be escalated to a panel with senior officials who will make a decision based upon what is that offender's history, what is the proposed bail address, what are the conditions that could be imposed, a not to contact, not to enter, for example, not to abide by a curfew, to potentially be tagged, and if the Governor has concerns then about safety, then that person will not be released.
What procedure will be followed to ensure that those being considered for early release pose absolutely no threat to the public, and what are the Minister's plans should one reoffend upon release?
Those people who are out will be on conditions. Those licence conditions mean that if a condition is breached, not necessarily committing an offence, but if the condition is breached, not only will they be recalled for the period of ECSL, but potentially for the entire balance of their sentence.
Thank you, Alicia. Don't go away. We'll be coming back to you in a few minutes' time. But let's go to Cardiff now and our Wales political correspondent, Cemlyn Davis, who's at the Welsh Parliament, the Senedd. Cemlyn, there was some falling out this week over the First Minister's reluctance last week to answer questions relating to the UK COVID inquiry.
Yes, that's right. During last week's First Minister's questions, Mark Drakeford said he wouldn't answer questions from opposition party leaders relating to the evidence that had been heard by the UK COVID inquiry. That inquiry has spent the past 3 weeks sitting in Cardiff, scrutinising some of the decisions taken by the Welsh Government during the pandemic. Mr Drakeford said at the time that he wouldn't offer a preview of the evidence that he would give himself to the inquiry. But he then gave a radio interview that was broadcast last weekend where he did discuss COVID. And so that led to fresh questions this week from opposition party leaders over whether Mr Drakeford was trying to dodge scrutiny.
First Minister, last week I challenged you on various comments and evidence that had been made to the COVID inquiry. You wouldn't answer those questions, and I accept the point that you made, that you had due respect and regard for the COVID inquiry, but here we are on the floor of the Welsh Parliament. Over the weekend, I tuned into a radio programme, Times Radio. You were quite happy to wax lyrically on there about the COVID inquiry and your relationship with the UK government. Why is there a difference in your ability to speak about the COVID response of the Welsh Government to the media, but you're not prepared to speak on the floor of the Welsh Parliament when you're challenged on the evidence that's in the public domain?
Will the First Minister admit now that his failure to answer those questions last week, whilst being willing to give the radio interview, will be seen as an attempt to avoid parliamentary scrutiny?
I answer questions on the floor of the Senedd every week. I will be here next week, as the Llywydd said, answering questions after I have given my evidence. I will be answering questions next week in front of the Committee for the Scrutiny of the First Minister. I will answer questions at the right moment.
Mark Drakeford there, taking part in his penultimate session of First Minister's questions before he steps down next week. And with regard to that radio interview, Mr Drakeford said he'd been able to carefully craft his answers in that interview so as not to preempt the inquiry's questions. He did give evidence to the inquiry on Wednesday, where he acknowledged in hindsight that the Welsh Government wasn't ready for COVID when it struck. He was also very critical of the then Prime Minister Boris Johnson's response to the pandemic.
And members of the Welsh Parliament have also been debating plans to try to boost the representation of women in the Senedd. What was said?
Yes, these are proposals that would require political parties heading into future Senedd elections to draw up lists of candidates where at least half of the names would be women. And the idea is that that would help to boost the number of women here in the Senedd and so make this place more representative. But there is some opposition to the plans, as we heard on Tuesday.
Increasing the representation of women is not only about improving representation for women, it's about improving representation for everyone. And evidence shows that one of the main barriers to the election of women is the fact that some political parties have not put forward women candidates in sufficient numbers. This trend applies also in Wales.
We believe that people should be elected to this Senedd and should be candidates for election to this Senedd on the basis of merit, and I can hear people rehearsing that line, on the basis of merit, not because of the colour of their skin, not because of the fact that they self-identify to be a man or a woman, not because of their sexual orientation or anything else, but because people want to elect them. And we believe that anybody should have the opportunity to be elected. So that's why we will be opposing this bill and the time wasting that I believe it's doing in this Senedd, because it's a reserved matter to the UK Parliament.
And that final point there is crucial, because there is some debate as to whether the Senedd actually has the power to be able to do this. Earlier this week, the presiding officer, the llywydd here at the Senedd, wrote to MSs saying that she has doubts as to whether the Senedd can actually do this. But the Welsh Government disagrees, and so it's cracking on with this legislation. And it'll remain to be seen if this gets through here, if it will be challenged in due course in the Supreme Court by the UK Government.
Finally, Cemlyn, the Senedd also heard an apology this week from one MS, Member of Parliament, who's now been banned from Cardiff Bay for several weeks because of his behaviour.
Yes, a report published last week said that Rhys Owen had sworn at and inappropriately touched two women on a night out back in the summer of 2021. That report followed an investigation by the Senedd's standards watchdog, which began in the autumn of 2022, and Rhys Owen was suspended from the Plaid Cymru group soon afterwards. And in light of the watchdog's findings, the Senedd's Standards Committee proposed a ban of 6 weeks for Mr Owen, and that was discussed here on Wednesday.
The recommendation is the longest exclusion proposed to date by a Standards Committee, and it reflects the seriousness of the breach of the Code of Conduct and the Committee's determination to uphold that fundamental principle of respect. The Senedd must be a safe and inclusive workplace where everybody is treated equally. Those working for and serving members should not feel that they must tolerate behaviour that is not acceptable.
My behaviour on the night in question fell far short of the standard expected of a public official. And for that, I do apologise unreservedly, mainly to those present and affected by my behaviour that evening, now nearly 3 years ago, to you, my colleagues, to my family, and to the public. I had too much to drink that night and I behaved badly. I accept responsibility for my behaviour and the consequences of that behaviour.
Well, Mr Owen did also raise questions about this process, in particular around how long it had taken and also around transparency. In the end, the Senedd backed that proposal, banning Mr Owen from the Senedd for 6 weeks without pay.
Cemlyn Davis in Cardiff Bay, thank you very much. Now, let's go over to Belfast now and join our reporter Mark Devonport, who's in Stormont. Now, Mark, it's St Patrick's Day weekend coming up, and it's become a tradition for a number of politicians from both Stormont and Dublin to head over to Washington, DC at this time of year.
That's right, Sean. And as you say, Irish government ministers and Stormont leaders are currently busy making friends and influencing people across the other side of the Atlantic for St Patrick's Day. With the recent restoration of devolution here, there's going to be quite a focus on Stormont's new power-sharing couple, the First and Deputy First Ministers, Michelle O'Neill and Emma Little Pengelly. They'll be meeting President Biden inside the White House. But amidst all the upbeat mood music, there's also controversy this year because some campaigners believe that Irish politicians should be boycotting the St Patrick's Day festivities because of the United States' support for Israel's military campaign in Gaza. Here's Jerry Carroll from the left-wing party People Before Profit.
In a few days' time, people will celebrate St Paddy's Day with crack and ceol. But this year there's a real sinister edge which needs to be challenged and called out. We have a man with the biggest arsenal of weapons in human history behind him, trying to use his lineage, his family history, to give himself a bye ball for the carnage and slaughter he has supported for the last 6 months. That man's name is Joe Biden. It's crystal clear that without the checks, the tanks, the fighter jets sent by the US, 30,000 Palestinians would still be alive today. And Deputy Speaker, I'm making a final call to all party leaders here, but especially Mary Lou MacDonald and Michelle O'Neill. Don't help facilitate and rehabilitate Genocide Joe.
Strong words there from Jerry Carroll from People Before Profit. Defending their participation, Sinn Féin say that their representatives will raise the need for an immediate ceasefire in Gaza, and the DUP says the opportunity to interact with some of the world's most important decision makers shouldn't be lost. The official opposition party at Stormont, though, the SDLP, say that they will be boycotting the White House reception.
And Mark, members of the Northern Ireland Assembly have also been reacting to the Canova report, which was published last week. And this is the report into murders which are linked to the army spy known as Steak Knife. What did they have to say?
Yes, Steak Knife is the code name which was given to a man called Freddie Scappaticci, who was a double agent who spied for the British Army inside the IRA during the Troubles. Now, there were claims that he had saved hundreds of lives, but the Canova team, led by John Boucher, who's currently the Chief Constable of the Police Service of Northern Ireland, found that that was an exaggeration and linked Agent Steak Knife to as many as 40 murders. The team has called for apologies from both the British government and the Irish Republican leadership on the part of the IRA. On Monday, Assembly members responded to the report's findings.
We must keep a sense of perspective. Republican terrorists were responsible for 60% of the overall Troubles killings, Loyalists for 30%, and the security forces for 10%. Not that the inquiries would convey that.
We have an urgent responsibility to recognise and acknowledge the hurt that the families feel and to help all those affected to heal. Let me be very clear in saying that we as a party are wholeheartedly committed to healing the wounds of the past and playing our part in whatever way we can.
I note the interim report calls for apologies. I don't think an apology cuts it, Principal Deputy Speaker. As party leader at Hass O'Sullivan and Stormont House, I called for acknowledgement statements from all parties. And I think we should all acknowledge that nobody's hands are clean. And I think that is the only proper start to dealing with our legacy.
Steak Knife, it has been claimed repeatedly by those in the state and elsewhere who defended what they did, just as they defended collusion with loyalist paramilitaries, said the Steak Knife, quote, to quote Canova, saved countless lives. He did not. This is a grotesque indictment of the state's dirty war on this island and their handling of agents. And, Madam Deputy Speaker, the response of the UK Government to simply gloss over this, to not even engage with the detail of the interim report, let alone offer the apology that John Boucher asked for, is utterly unacceptable and offensive to the families and offensive to the rest of us in this society.
The Northern Ireland Secretary Chris Heaton-Harris acknowledges that this interim report is a hard read. He's not ruling out an official apology, but says the government will wait for a final report to be published later this year.
And finally, Mark, a ban on hunting with dogs was raised in the Assembly this week. What happened?
Yes, unlike other parts of the UK, hunting with dogs is still legal here in Northern Ireland, despite past attempts to ban it. Now, with the restoration of devolution, there's a renewed campaign from animal welfare charities, backed by some MLAs, such as the Alliance Party's John Blair.
There is no doubt that hunting with dogs is an outdated and brutally cruel activity which has no place in a civilised modern-day society. The practices and effects of hunting, such as wild mammals being chased across fields in the countryside and dogs suffering life-threatening injuries, are not sources of entertainment, far from it. This so-called sport, which is cruel to both the wild animals being hunted and the dogs that are being used in the hunt and encouraged to chase and kill those wild animals.
That's John Blair from the Alliance Party. His last attempt to ban hunting with dogs failed 3 years ago, but he's now confirmed he's going to bring another private member's bill to try to abolish the practice.
Thank you, Mark. Mark Devonport at Stormont there. Now, we've got time to bring you just one more story from Westminster. Alicia, this week, MPs on the Home Affairs Committee were looking at the controversial issue of asylum seekers and religious conversion. And this all came about following claims that the Clapham attacker had been granted asylum because he'd converted to Christianity. Tell us more.
Yeah, that's right. Abdul Azadi, who you'll remember back at the start of the year, was responsible for this corrosive chemical attack on a woman and 2 children. Now, there are claims that he was allowed to stay in the UK after a priest confirmed that he had converted to Christianity. And then there were several wider claims about this. So the Home Affairs Committee is looking into it. Now, it heard first from the Reverend Matthew Firth, who was a priest in Darlington. And he said that when he joined St Cuthbert's Church, there were a large number of young male asylum seekers requesting baptisms.
Obviously, when baptisms are already in the system and you arrive as a new incumbent, you honour those baptisms because it's not an honourable thing to do suddenly to cancel things. But then I started sort of looking into it a bit further, and after those baptisms, week in, week out, significant groups of mainly Iranian and Syrian young male asylum seekers were being brought to me in sizable cohorts. I honoured the baptisms that were the baptism requests that were already in the system, but then you spot a pattern, and then you think, hang on, there's something going on here, and then you try to press a pause button, which is to make sure that people are requested to come to church and start getting involved and attending church regularly, events and so on. And that was the thing that kind of made the numbers fall off a cliff in a sense, because those people kind of melted away, really. They weren't really wanting to get involved with the life of the church so much after I sort of requested them to do so.
You wouldn't be expecting a member of your church generally to come to every bringing by sale, every bake sale, every single event.
No. But I think what you'd expect is that for people who are kind of woven into the warp and weft of a church community, you would expect that they are involved in the community life of the church, that are involved in the worshipping life of the church, whether that's Sunday or midweek or a study group.
I wondered actually, Bishop, whether you could perhaps start us off with your reflections on what we've just been hearing about what was happening in Darlington between 2018 and 2020. If there's anything you'd like to say in response to the evidence that we've just heard.
The figures don't quite add up for me. I think the objection that the Diocese of Durham had was the suggestion that the church is being a conveyor belt for asylum-seeking cases, and that the figures over a kind of 10-year period, best part of a 10-year period, just don't demonstrate that from that parish, nor indeed more widely. Where numbers of asylum seekers have gone up, this is generally across the board, numbers of baptisms, certainly in the Church of England, haven't gone up in correlation. Obviously, where we see hotels or kind of high-density population of asylum seekers, it's likely to be the churches in those areas that will see asylum seekers coming to them. You know, our churches respond to local need however it presents itself. That's a totally separate issue to saying that we are kind of quickly and easily and freely baptising large numbers in order to scam the asylum process, which is properly the responsibility of the government, the Home Office, the courts, the tribunals.
We know the asylum process system is broken in this country. We all know that. Do you think with what Reverend Firth had to say, that the church is adding to the problem?
As I've said already, we want to be part of the conversation going forward, and if we can help, and if there is data that is presented that suggests that there is a serious problem, then absolutely we want to be part of that conversation.
Okay, final question.
What I can say from the Home Office's part is that we recognise that recent cases have given rise to an interest in this issue. We haven't got specific evidence of facilitation, but where there are issues that are raised about specific cases and the evidence within specific cases and particular issues, we will look into those issues.
Thank you very much, Alicia. And that's all for Politics UK this week. Politics Live will be back on Monday at 12:15 on BBC Two and iPlayer.